I think she might be dyslexic. I'm like, no way. Like, there is no way. 3 out of 3? And then our specialist says, all 3 of your kids are dyslexic. Genetically, that means you guys are dyslexic. The heritability is up to 70%. Wow. When we see a dyslexic, one of the main questions is, all right, is there anyone else in your family who has dyslexia? Their child has an amazing brain, and they learn differently.
What does it tell us about how children with dyslexia process language itself?
There's a lot we're still finding out. Our youngest, what she used to say at this age was, what are we doing yesterday? You mean tomorrow, sweetie? No, yesterday. What are we doing yesterday?
Some kids like you can just outgrow dyslexia.
That is...
It's kind of tough being dyslexic, and I often have to go over the question multiple times to make sure I read it correctly. What my previous school did is they kind of just ignored it.
And so we got to a place where we had an IEP issued for him, which should be a good thing, right? It's extra time, extra energy from the teachers, but we're talking 15 to 30 minutes a couple times a week. And even with those accommodations, we still didn't see enough progress to where we felt comfortable that he was going to excel in the large school setting. The breaking point was when other kids at school maybe didn't understand the way he thinks, processes, and engages. And then that resulted in what we viewed as bullying. And immediately my wife and I knew that a change was needed. When your kid struggles, it's really tough. Yeah.
For many parents, hearing the words "your child has dyslexia" can be a moment filled with confusion, worry, and uncertainty. But what if we could flip the script and see dyslexia not as a barrier, but as a difference in how the brain learns? Dr. Dan Peters is a licensed psychologist, executive coach, author, and co-founder of Summit Center, where he's spent over 25 years helping children, teens, and families navigate anxiety, dyslexia, giftedness, and twice exceptionality. He's also the host of Make It a Great One with Dr. Dan. Dr. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to have you here. You know, I know that you have more than just a professional connection to dyslexia. I know that it's also a very personal one for you. So I would love to start with your origin story. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about how you began your work with dyslexia and that personal tie that you have to it.
Oh, wow. Okay. It's real and it's personal. So I was... and still am a licensed psychologist, and I specialize in children, as we do at our center. And I was deep into the field of neurodiversity in my training before we even were calling it neurodiversity, and evaluating for ADHD and autism spectrum and dyslexia and everything related. And all of a sudden, our oldest, who's now 25, we were told in our exit interview from preschool that, she's not really picking up all the sounds with the letters, and she's missing some of the numbers and the ordering, some difficulty with sound to symbol. And we really think that you should get your child evaluated for a learning disability. So we listened. My wife and I shook our head. I walked out and I said, honey, she's 4. The brain is malleable. People learn in different ways. There's time. I mean, I think this teacher, she's excellent, which she was excellent. And she was right. I said, we're just going to give her time. Get to kindergarten, we get the same thing. And then I had an experience. So I'm going to fast forward a few things here, but I had an experience where she was evaluated by a close friend who's a psychologist, gave us the feedback at our dining room table in the most comfortable place ever, and then told us the news about the weaknesses, the challenges, and the dyslexia, which at the time felt devastating because of where we were in our understanding of dyslexia at the time, now 20 years ago. Fast forward, we're concerned that our oldest is going to be passed up by our middle son, because he's really sharp. He thinks about lots of things. And lo and behold, he's not picking up the letters and the numbers, and he's having trouble spelling his name, which is Joe. And he's teaching us about the solar system at the same time. So now we got 2. Then at this point, my wife started to become a specialist in dyslexia. She left nursing and was starting to focus on it. And I was diving in because it was now personal and going to the conferences and doing the reading. And it was the beginning of the strength-based movement of dyslexia, which I know we'll talk about. And then my wife says about our third, so they're all about 2 years apart, I think she might be dyslexic. I'm like, no way. Like, there is no way. 3 out of 3? She gets evaluated by our specialist, and then our specialist says, all 3 of your kids are dyslexic. Genetically, that means that you guys are dyslexic. And she said, Dan, think about what you're good at, and think about all the stuff that is hard for you, and think about your school experience. And my whole world just kind of, it was like, this is your life. And what I tell people, so I was probably at the time close to 40. I had had the practice, had written books, had the center, and it was the first time with that explanation that I felt smart. It changed my life and the lives that we've touched. And so twofold. One is understanding what this is and what it isn't is a whole different lens for identity development. And 2, what I want to go back to it, how it changed things. When I got the feedback from our close friend about our first daughter's diagnosis, I realized how our field has trained us to talk about different learning disabilities. Now we like to focus on differences as well, and how the language can be pathological and problem-focused and not focused on the strengths that are also in the profile.
Exactly. Wow. Thank you for sharing that story with us. What a powerful moment that you said the first time in your life. You said, I'm smart. This is the disability that I've had for so long, and the power of naming that, I think, for children must be so incredibly transforming for them, because up until that point, there was so much of a lack of understanding, right, in their experience, and just by naming it and understanding can change the way they think about themselves.
They can, and what we've also learned is that it's also part of identity development that some kids adopt a learning difference and a profile right away, and they just jump in. And others, depending on their age, where they don't want to be different, they don't want to be seen as different, they don't want to seen as having problems, it takes a longer time. But part of this whole approach of helping people with dyslexia or any neurodevelopmental difference is accepting who they are in a way where you see we all have strengths and we all have challenges, whether we have labels or not. We all have them. And it's how do we help them adopt this holistic view of themselves?
Yeah. I love that. And so since you have this personal connection, Dr. Dan, you know what it feels like to be a parent and to hear the words, your child has dyslexia. What do you want parents and families to know when they hear for the first time your child has dyslexia?
I want them to know their child has an amazing brain, has tremendous skills, tremendous abilities, and really some superpowers that we really want to build upon. And they learn differently. And they have a learning difference. And in our educational world and medical world, it's often called a disability, but we're going to dive deeper into how things work and what's harder. I also want them to know that these kids can thrive. These kids can be active, engaged learners with the right environment, with the right understanding, and with the right intervention. And all of those things, which we will have to do a deeper dive after we give people this information, is all of this stuff can be figured out, and we know how to do this, and there's a science out there, and we need to follow what works. But for right now, what you're needing to take in is that your child is really unique and special, and we're going to figure out how they learn best and what this means for their life now and for their life future in school and outside of school.
Yeah, I love that. And, in some of the research coming up into this podcast, I came across, the neurodiversity definition of just us thinking, in the future of this is just how all of our brains are functioning differently. Yeah. We're all neurodiverse. And so understanding the specific needs, labeling it and putting a name to it is a game changer for our kids. Yeah.
Dan, you said that 3 out of 3 were dyslexic, and did you ever formally get diagnosed with dyslexia?
I did not get formally diagnosed. There really wasn't, for my wife and I, there wasn't a need at that point.
Right.
It was clear. The writing was on the wall. I just want one thing about that, just to show that dyslexic, like you meet a dyslexic. There's such a variety of patterns and strengths and challenges, even though there's common threads. So the joke in our family is my wife devours books, and rarely remembers them. Even will read another one and say, I think I read this at the end. And she reads very fast. I read very slowly, and I remember what I read. And both is what can happen with dyslexia. So there's different patterns that we see.
That is so interesting. Could you dive a little bit deeper into like the brain science and what does it tell us about how students or children with dyslexia process language itself?
There's a lot we're still finding out. The science really took a leap in the 90s with brain scans and functional MRIs to really see like how is the dyslexic brain different than non-dyslexic brains, and where are the challenges? And so to like pan back for a sec, we think of our hemispheres, and the left hemisphere is usually famous for language, logic, detail. The right brain, spatial awareness, creativity, art, big picture. So the language centers are primarily in the left hemisphere. And when you look at brain scans, what you see is the neural activity is different in dyslexic brains versus non-dyslexic brains when you're having a dyslexic read. So for a non-dyslexic, the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere, the language side, is lit up, and also parts of the right side is lit up, but more left generally than right. When a dyslexic reads, there's very little of the left side of the left hemisphere lit up. And there seems to be a compensatory mechanism in the more of the right brain, the spatial brain, the big picture brain is lit up. And so what's fascinating is when they've done more and more studies, there's different brain patterns for dyslexic and non-dyslexics beyond just reading, eating, driving, putting on your clothes. So the dyslexic brain seems to have different neural network patterns. And the question is, well, is it a compensatory mechanism, or is it actually just the way that brain is designed to do different things? And one more finding we see is in the phonological part of the language brain, there seem to be less connections with dyslexics related to compared to non-dyslexics.
So you had mentioned, again, I'm fascinated. I left high school knowing that I wanted to be a biology teacher. So tell me a little bit more. Does the research back up that there are genetic indicators that could point or lead to
Absolutely.
Dyslexia?
Absolutely. The heritability is up to 70%.
Wow.
So when we see a dyslexic, one of the main questions is, all right, is there anyone else in your family who has dyslexia? These days you get more and more of, yes, there's a cousin or my uncle or grandparent. Often though you get no, which I'm sure we'll get to with the underdiagnosis of dyslexia, particularly in earlier days. And then you have to ask the question of, well, did anyone in your family struggle to read and write? Have difficulty in school, drop out of school? And conversely, is there anyone in your family who's incredibly talented with visual spatial skills, constructional skills, engineering, inventing? And they're like, oh yeah, like my dad, grandpa, he dropped out of school at 16, and I think he has about 10 patents. He started 3 businesses, and he's an electrical engineer and architect. A little overstatement, but not that far.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Wow. So why is dyslexia often missed or misdiagnosed for years, especially now that we have so much information about how the brain works and so much visibility into how students are learning much earlier on? How are we misdiagnosing?
Well, we're missing and we're misdiagnosing. And so it's really the lens. So it's who's looking. It depends on where you live in the country. So some states have dyslexia identification and treatment mandates. Others don't. Depends on the district. If your district in the public sector adopts dyslexia identification and treatment, it depends then if your school psychologist or or private psychologist actually has training in dyslexia. And when I went to grad school over 25 years ago, I don't ever recall learning about dyslexia. Not once. I do know colleagues that I will mention, I'm sure today, Drs. Brock and Furnett-Eide, who they're the authors of the Dyslexic Advantage and the Dyslexic Advantage nonprofit. They teach in graduate schools, and they're surprised when they're in the education department teaching dyslexia in graduate school. They might be like 1-2 hour class. And so we have a problem with the PR, the movement of understanding that this is thought to be 15 to 20% of the U.S. population, and the thought is 5 to 10% of the world population, if not more. And so it's about education. And again, across the board, if you're trained in it, you're looking for it. If you're not trained in it, you're looking for a reading disorder, a writing disorder, a language disorder, which is a very nondescript category, whereas the dyslexic process is pretty well defined, and you can get there or get halfway there just with a really extensive clinical interview looking at all the developmental signs. So that's like the mist. And then when we think of misdiagnosis, there's lots of other things it could look like. So, people are really quick to diagnose ADHD. And when you diagnose ADHD, then what the reading issues get blamed on is trouble sitting still, trouble paying attention, or missing a lot of school, which may or may not be true, lazy, lack of effort. Then you have people who will diagnose dysgraphia, the writing challenges, and they'll say, well, it's just dysgraphia, it's not dyslexia, or it's dysgraphia and it's ADHD. And then there's anxiety. And a lot of these kids develop anxiety and they shut down, and people say, well, that's just their anxiety. They're perfectionists. They're afraid to make a mistake. So
all of these things are what it's masked as.
So if you're not looking and you don't know, and a lot of them come together, you really have to be looking to pull everything apart, put it all on the table, and try to just see what is this child's unique profile.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say we're not framing this around, hey, parents and educators should act as clinicians and being able to spot the signs, but just out of curiosity, how does dyslexia show up differently at different ages or grade levels?
So early on, what we typically see, often, not always, but there's often later to talk speech. So a lot of times when you later are assessing someone for dyslexia, you see an earlier IEP for a speech delay, because that's before they're doing academics. So we often have delayed speech. We see kids missaying words. It's cute, hospitable, or for hospital, marote for remote, fun things, Paschetti. Those are things we see early on. Some kids outgrow them. Some kids still have those language-based challenges. We see difficulty, as I was talking about with my daughter, trouble identifying and labeling a letter or a number, just not remembering it. Trouble remembering, this is early on, days of the week. What day is it? What day is tomorrow? Sequencing is also a challenge for our youngest. What she used to say at this age was, what are we doing yesterday? Like, you mean tomorrow, sweetie? No, yesterday. What are we doing yesterday? So that's a sequencing challenge that is very common with dyslexics in the ordering of things. And then when you get into elementary school, now we're seeing problems still identifying letters and sounds, remembering sight words, substituting words, So missaying words. So you put a word in there that's not there. You flip words like saw instead of was. You substitute for the. You're just kind of going on like trying to put it all together. You have trouble spelling. You have trouble writing. You have slow processing speed. And that's when we now get it up to, I would say, 5th or 6th grade on. Now we're seeing tests are really hard because you misread test questions. You have trouble. You have more automatic processing. Processing is very slow. So you have to think really hard. It doesn't become just automatic. This is why kids do benefit with more time on tests where they can think. Writing is difficult. It's hard to get those ideas on paper in the same way someone can think and someone can talk. So you start to see those discrepancies. And it continues into the grades and through high school if there is not accommodation, remediation, and teaching to the person's learning style, because it becomes so heavy on reading and writing only to show your mastery. And what we see is as you get older and older, there's this kind of late blooming thinking style and maturity that the more and more a student can rely on their critical thinking skills, their big picture thinking, their problem solving, they start to excel. But in those earlier grades in traditional formats, it's repetition, it's memory, rote memory,
rote learning.
Rote, and dyslexics are very poor at rote learning and rote memory.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few accommodations, and I'm curious to know how do we know when an accommodation is helping and when it might be getting in the way of a student's progress?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good question, and it's something we think about all the time. It's like what is something which is empowering versus enabling? And you have to work with each student, and it's trial and error, because we're trying to get a student to be a engaged learner, an empowered learner. Because what typically happens is when a child is not identified and or is identified but not getting the appropriate accommodations and support, you start to shut down. Right? You start to shut down. You start to hide. You literally will go to the bathroom every time you can because you don't want to read. You don't want to be called on. You don't know how to do your homework. You don't want people to think you're stupid. You don't want your writing to be hung up where everyone gets to see it at open house when you don't put vowels in the right places and you don't know your punctuation. So what we're really trying to do is bring accommodation of extended time. Here, instead of you taking notes, we're going to give you notes so you can actually listen and learn. We are going to scaffold for you. We're going to help you. We're going to help you with idea generation, and then we're going to help you form sentences so we can put together your ideas. We're going to have you tell us the story that then we will adapt into written word because you're so much stronger in your storytelling verbally, and then we're going to help you develop into a writer because dyslexics are amazing storytellers. So I think it's always asking the question that you're saying is, when does it help and when does it start to hinder? We should always have that in mind, but starting off with not enough is not the way we want to lean. Like, if anything, like, let's give a little more and then let's back it out because we want this person to step into their learning. We want them to have confidence and we want them to feel good about themselves ultimately, or there's not going to be any learning.
Yeah. Now, if we have, as a parent, we want to advocate so fiercely for our kids, right? So how can a parent advocate for some of these additional accommodations that their child might not be receiving in a traditional school? What's the best way for that partnership to emerge?
Partnership is the key word. And I do understand, and I've been a part of many situations where there are a lot of emotions because your child is struggling. And so that being said, we want to come to the table as a partner, and you're the educator, you're the expert. We trust you. Our child is struggling in learning to read, in spelling, in reading comprehension, is anxious at home, is having meltdowns over homework because they don't understand it or their hands hurt when they have to write so much. We believe there might be a learning disorder such as dyslexia, or we obtained an evaluation and now we have this diagnosis with some recommendations. We work together to see how you can support our child? And you want to lean in there and you want to start with the trust. And I know everyone has different experiences and different places are very different. Start with trust. And then we have to just push harder and harder if our child's not getting their needs met. Whether that is we need to push on the school, we need to have extra meetings with the teacher, special ed department. We need to look into tutors privately. And this is where we look to alternative learning environments like Fusion, to where can our child get their needs met and where are they understood? Like, where is their profile understood, where it'll be brought out of them instead of them having to conform to a model which was not meant for their brain.
You had said something that I have been thinking about, and I want to learn more. You said that dyslexics are oftentimes amazing storytellers. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I'm going to back up with bringing in Brock and Fernette-Eide, Doctors Brock and Fernette-Eide into Dyslexic Advantage. So they coined the mind strengths, MIND. So mnemonics for dyslexics like me to remember. So M stands for material reasoning. So dyslexics are generally very strong with 3D spatial reasoning, which is why we get so many inventors, architects, builders. I mean, across fields, but we see a lot of that. I stands for interconnected reasoning. Dyslexics are strong in putting vast and diverse properties and principles together to come up with novel solutions. So dyslexics, again, with that right brain, is that pattern brain, big picture brain, put things together. So a lot of times when you see Nobel Prize winners, they are taking from, who might be dyslexic, they are taking from several different disciplines of science, coming up with a novel solution or idea. N stands for narrative reasoning. So you can see my dyslexic brain is highly contextual, so I have to work my way in there.
Keep
so
going.
N stands for narrative reasoning, and narrative reasoning is storytelling. So whether it's a visual story or arc or a literary story or arc, we think of Roald Dahl, Patricia Polacco. I mean, there are so many. Those are just the children's venue, Jules Verne. So many. They bring things to life. And another dyslexic strength that relates to that is declarative memory and episodic memory, which is remembering experiences. So whereas dyslexics are not strong on rote memory and procedural memory, like what do you do first, second, and third, very strong on any situation or experience that they have been a part of becomes a story. And so when you ask a child, dyslexic child, diagnosed or not diagnosed, what did you guys do when you went over to your friend's house? What did you guys do for lunch? Well, when we woke up, and all of a sudden there's a whole contextual story that goes all the way through, and my wife will just say, "Can you just answer my question?" I'm like, but there's so much more you need to know. Okay. And then D, to finish off the mind strengths, is dynamic reasoning, which is the ability to take past and present data points and predict future outcomes. We call this the entrepreneur trait, because a lot of times entrepreneurs have this ability to see, and dyslexics are disproportionately represented in the successful entrepreneur category. You don't have to be dyslexic to be a good entrepreneur. But it's a strong presence there. And this last thing, it brings me to intuition. So dyslexics tend to be highly intuitive. And what we need to be thinking about in raising our kids and teaching our kids is, when I was growing up, and we still have a science-based and kind of math-based thinking, which is, if you can't show your work, if you can't show it to me on a spreadsheet in business, it doesn't exist. Tell me how you know this. A lot of dyslexics have an intuition, and they can't always understand why. I had a dyslexic musician on a podcast recently, and he talked about, and he and his wife do the New York Times jumble. And he said he knows the words are that his wife can't figure it out. He figures out the word and he says, "Honey, this is what it is. How do you spell it?" He could see what word goes there because of the context and the letters without knowing how to spell it. And that is a good example of that disconnect in a dyslexic brain, and why we don't want to disempower knowledge because you can't always show your work.
Well said.
That is so interesting that you mentioned that you had a client that was a musician as well. I'm wondering, I mean, when I think about reading, and by no means was I ever an English teacher or reading specialist, but it's basically decoding symbols, correct? With reading. Now, how does that translate into reading of music?
Yes. Okay, that's a really good question. So I have worked with some, so right brain, music side of the brain, I have worked with some musician prodigies and who have been on all the big stages at very young ages. A huge number of them who were dyslexic couldn't read music. And they had, when they started going to the academies, they had to learn to read music after they were prodigies, which was very difficult for them because it is another symbol system.
It's so important to understand the impact of being able to get to these students, these learners early on, right? Because if we can get to dyslexic students early enough, we can, like what you're saying, we can empower them. They can become confident human beings and adults. So tell us, for students that have dyslexia that often struggle with self-esteem and confidence issues due to their learning difference, how can we support those challenges as part of the intervention process?
Understanding how they learn. Sounds so simple, but first we have to understand as adults, parents, educators, how do they learn? Then we need to empower them with understanding how they learn and what parts of their brain processes information at a very high level, a very quick level, and what parts of their brains have more challenges in certain ways. How do we maximize the strengths and leverage the strengths? So, for example, like a verbal ability or a visual spatial ability. And then how do we remediate, improve the areas of challenge, but also work around it? Like, we don't always have to go through the brick wall, right? So, for example, when I was in college, you could pay to get your notes, to get the notes. And I didn't understand that at the time. When you are writing and listening, if you have dyslexia, you're doing the two things that are hard for you to do at the same time. I have to listen to what you're saying. Now I have to convert that into a word. Now I have to get it out my sloppy handwriting, and I have to keep up, and I have to be, now I'm behind, now I'm missing. And then the idea now, so now it's almost universal in colleges and many high schools that you can get notes so you can sit back and just listen and learn, because a lot of these folks are auditory learners. A lot of these folks are visual learners. If you have time to learn, listen and learn, we're moving around a system instead of, no, you need to learn to write and take notes in a classroom.
Yeah.
Because that's the only way you're going to be a successful student. So that's just one example, is how do we just understand how this person works? And it's like, it's not rocket science. I understand teachers have a really big job when you have all of these 20, 30 brains sitting in front of you and you need to individualize, but there are a lot of universal accommodations that benefit everyone in the classroom.
Dan, I'm going to take a couple of thoughts and try to put them together. You had mentioned the idea of diagnoses for yourself, well, not official diagnosis for yourself, and how that sort of changed your lens on identity. And when I think of identity, it's sort of sense-making in the world and where you belong in the world and what part you play in that. To also the point that you had made about dyslexic learners are highly contextual, and they're very much, they remember the experiences. Now, I'm imagining that a child with a late diagnosis is probably going to go through a fair amount of shame and a lot of contextual experiences that they've had to put together. I'm imagining that that's part of your work too, in being able to help kids.
Yes. Those were put together nicely. Yes. So the longer we go through life, kids go through life not understanding a learning difference or a learning disability, and I think there's value in both of those terms depending on what we're using them for, there is shrapnel, like there is scar tissue, there is shame, there is anxiety, there is feeling less than, there is feeling dumber than your friends and your peers. The earlier we catch that, the more we can impact their identity and actually have a really significant role in that identity formation and that identity development. And it's never too late. There's just more that you have to work through, generally speaking, if you are not identified or are identified and not in a learning environment that teaches to you. It teaches more in the traditional way. And when we think about this, to be fair, the traditional way does work for the majority of students, right? So this is the dilemma of our sort of mass education system, is you're trying to help the most of them. But to your point, Mike, we deal with a lot of anxiety. We deal with a lot of lack of confidence, a lot of rebuilding. And when you're able to do this work, change the environment, change the understanding, and really lean on those strengths, you do see a different student and person emerge.
So many students with dyslexia, because of the way that it presents itself, have been bullied, right? And so what kind of advice would you give parents to overcome some of that emotional hurt?
Yeah. First of all, I mean, bullying is, it's a really hard reality of life for many students. And if your child is being bullied, you gotta deal with it, and you gotta bang the drum. You gotta go to the school. If you can, get your child into counseling, because it does just erode confidence. And as kids get older, we know when you get towards middle school and high school, there's just a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of ways that kids cope and self-medicate.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is prevent that or reduce that and show an alternative. And so for parents, it's really hard, and you need professionals on your team. You can't do it alone. Like, you can love your child to the end of the earth, but they're in the world usually as they grow and grow more than they're in your world with you. And so love is enough, but it's not sufficient against bullying. And we need to get in there. We need to try to change the environment. We need intervention. And again, we need counseling. And sometimes all we can do is what we call like hold the space for our child. You know, there's nothing worse than seeing your child struggle and feeling so powerless over that struggle. Your presence, holding that space, allowing them to have emotions, allowing them to be confusing, allowing them to express their emotion on you, which we don't always like to experience. But if we're the safe place, they need a place for it to come out, as long as it is safe and not hurtful.
So well said. I was listening. It was a parenting class. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old. So they're young, but one of the most powerful, impactful questions that I heard from this course that I took was, what's the compassionate story there? What's the compassionate story about what your child is experiencing? Right? Like that's such a powerful question as a parent to hold.
Yes.
And to understand and really identify with this experience, whether it's bullying, whether it's shame. These things progress into adulthood, and they're hard to undo. And they're so hard to undo.
They are. If I can add to that compassionate story, is there was a book that came out probably 2 or 3 years ago now. Oprah co-wrote it with Dr. Bruce Perry, who is just a pioneer in brain science and trauma and abuse. And the name of the book is What Happened to You. And it's a compilation of their conversations over the last 30 years on her show and projects that they've done together, with the primary underlying concept is we see people of all ages acting in certain ways, and our natural human response is, what is wrong with you? And so much of our behavior comes from these difficult and often traumatic experiences. And the question we should be asking is, what happened? What happened to you? To try to really understand what's going on.
What happened to you? Thank you for that. Out of this conversation, dyslexic learners, I feel like they have so many abilities, right? So in summary, it's the way that I think about it is we want to remove and work through the disability part. Yes. Right? It's like we want to work with their brain and not against it. Exactly.
At our center, what we always talk about is we're going to tell you how your brain works, but our focus is not on what's wrong with you. Our focus is what's right with you. And that's the different lens, whether we call it a positive psychology lens, whether we call it a dyslexic advantage lens. We really want to flip the script. And that's what has changed. And that's where, if I had that script when our first was diagnosed versus what I know now in the work we do, it would have it would have helped with a lot of the pain and the worry. Still, there's going to be worry as a parent, right? Anytime your child is diagnosed or labeled with something that's a little different, we all worry about our kids. But there's such, to me, a quicker pivot now when we have such a fuller story about this brain profile and so many examples in the world of dyslexic innovators, business people, designers, every walk of life, and those are the people that are the ones who are speaking out. Whether it's Richard Branson, right? Whether it's Charles Schwab, whether it's Henry Winkler. Like, I was like this. So many actors and actresses are dyslexic, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, memorizing the script. They actually have to embody the script, right? They have to get into the narrative of the script and become the person. Because if they just focus on the words, it's tough.
What I'm hearing is that when a child is diagnosed, obviously the best pathway is to work with a professional like yourself. But what is the ideal synergy between school and a professional like yourself, or a parent and a professional like yourself, in supporting a child?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the big picture is when you say working with someone like me, let's break that down. So you do need a diagnostic evaluation to not only people say, I just want to know the diagnosis. But the reason we do comprehensive testing is because we're not looking for just a diagnosis. And dyslexic brains are so complex, particularly bright dyslexics, which is another reason for lack of diagnosis or misdiagnosis, is when a bright dyslexic compensates. So we need to have an evaluation that shows your pattern, your cognitive ability, your processing ability, your executive functions. Like it's more than just reading and writing. So that is essential. When it comes to beyond that, you don't always need a professional if your educator understands, right? So then the psychologist, the neuropsychologist, the educational therapist can be the consultant to help you understand the profile better and team with the school. But the good news is that schools get it. Like the schools that get it, the educators that get it, they get it. And it's about us all having an understanding of what is this brain like? What does it do well? Where is it more challenged? How are we going to support, get around, and focus on the things that they do really well to get to the same endpoint?
More of that, more of understanding how the brain works, more of pouring into these students and helping them understand what their abilities are. Yeah, abilities.
Now it's time to separate fact from fiction. It's time for some myth busting. All right, Dan, you ready?
Ready.
All right. Myth number 1, dyslexia just means that you see letters backwards.
Well, that is part of it. It happens for most people at some point, but not all dyslexics. And there is so much more to dyslexia than seeing numbers and letters backwards. You have trouble matching sounds to letters. You have trouble sounding out words. You have trouble with sight words. You have trouble often with math facts. You have trouble with days of the week, months of the year. You have trouble with spelling. You have trouble with writing, just to name a few. So that is an oversimplification of dyslexia.
What about this one? Myth number 2, that some kids like you can just outgrow dyslexia.
That is not true. You can get better at reading. You can get better at writing. You are still going to be a dyslexic and have a dyslexic brain. So usually you learn to compensate. You learn to move towards your strengths. You learn to stay away from some of those challenge areas whenever you can, but you still have a dyslexic brain and you always will.
Myth number 3, if a student could read, then they don't have dyslexia.
Not true. Not true. This is also one of the reasons of misdiagnosis or misdiagnosis, and that is because dyslexics can read. I could read, not well and not fast, but I could read. So yes, it's not a binary situation that lots of people think about.
Dr. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today, for your heart, for your brain, for all the information that you shared with us. I think it's going to be a powerful impact for our families as they advocate for their dyslexic learners.
It's my pleasure. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Every student learns differently, but when you truly understand how they learn, everything changes. And that's why Fusion Academy created a short quiz to help you better understand your students' learning DNA. In just a few minutes, you'll get personalized insights into your students' unique learning preferences, plus tips to better support them at home and in the classroom. Take the quiz today. It's quick, it's free, and it may just unlock your students' full potential. Visit fusionacademy.com/podcast. That's fusionacademy.com/podcast. We know learning differently requires showing up differently. So here are some tools, insights, and strategies to help. It's time for Real Talk, Real Tools. This week, I want to talk about tools I think are must-haves and game changers for students with dyslexia, especially in middle and high school, where content demands increase and writing expectations intensify. One of the most powerful supports is combining reading and listening with audio-supported text. Tools that read text aloud while highlighting words help students track and understand what they're reading. And when it comes to writing, speech-to-text tools let students focus on their ideas, not spelling or typing. AI-powered tools like Microsoft Immersive Reader, Speechify, or even Google Docs voice typing makes this more accessible than ever. Remember, key for everything. Make the learning meaningful and contextual. The dyslexic mind soaks it up and never forgets it. Try this. The next time your child is reading a challenging passage, open it up in an app that reads it aloud while they follow along. You're not making it easier. You're helping their brain work smarter. Or if you have students who struggle with writing or retaining information, try offering visual summaries as an option through sketchnotes. These are quick, low-pressure drawings. Think stick figures, arrows, and symbols that help students process and recall key ideas. It's not about art, it's about accessibility. And for students with dyslexia, ADHD, or working memory challenges, sketchnoting can transform the way that they engage with content. Try this. After reading or a lecture, invite students to sketch 3 to 5 big ideas using visuals instead of full sentences. You'll likely notice stronger retention and a lot more creativity in how they show what they know. Teacher tip, check out Sketchnote Army or the Noun Project for simple icons and ideas to help students get started.
Lynna, I'm thinking about all those tips that you just gave, and they're out there for parents and teachers to be able to use. And I'm also thinking about what Dr. Dan had said. Oftentimes we're thinking about having to fix the problem, but rather than going through the wall, like he said, let's leverage that kid's strengths so that we can work around that, leveraging what they have access to already.
Yep, exactly. I was visiting one of our campuses, Fusion Loudoun, and there is a SPED lead. Her name's Nancy Noor. She's an incredible teacher. She co-wrote a book with our Fusion students called The Dyslexic Fiddler Crab. And if you read it, it's just so powerful because what she enabled our kids to do is to take away the shame in their dyslexic disability and actually embrace the power of the way that their brain works. And I know that these students completely emerged after writing that book. And it was just such a powerful narrative of their experience.
I mean, I will say, one, our teachers are amazing. Number two, our students are absolutely amazing too, just what they can put together. But this idea of shame, right? This idea that kids into young adulthood, into full adulthood, could go on being misdiagnosed or undiagnosed through their entire lives, trying to figure out what the heck is up. Why has everything been harder for me than when I look at my peers and how hard they're working to be able to do well in school?
I think as advocates, that's one of the most important things that we need to pay attention to is how can we remove shame from the disability that they have? How can we help them understand that this is just a different way that their brain learns, right? We're all neurodiverse. Our brains are working in different ways. So that's just a part of their superpower.
Superpowers. I mean, I think it's amazing that Dr. Dan was able to frame that and just be able to state so many examples of successful adults that also have dyslexia. It's not a but it's an and they have this. And being able to think about how that brain science works, of being able to take all these disparate ideas and connect them. We are taught as young kids to think very logically in sequence, and that is what we're looking for in a successful students in the traditional school model. With this, let's continue to go down this thread of Who are the kids in front of us? What do they have to offer? And how can we make sure that they feel empowered to continue to use their unique brains in their unique ways?
Yeah, helping them become the best version of themselves.
That's amazing.
At a traditional school, you have a one-size-fits-all approach to learning. And at Fusion, we have found a customized, tailored approach for Alex. And the teachers have been phenomenal about just taking our feedback on what we see is happening at home, incorporating that into their curriculum, their schedule, their style. It just is a much more flexible approach. And I think we instantaneously knew this is going to be a differentiator for him.
Well, before Fusion, it felt a bit stressful since the teacher was going quickly through all the material and I really couldn't understand it. And Fusion is a great option for me simply due to the fact that the teacher only has to focus on me so we can go a bit slower and understand the material more. It's a lot more flexible here. They'll go at your pace. If you're having trouble understanding something, they'll go slower. But if you completely understand something, they'll go a bit quicker. And it really helps when you're going at your own pace. And it helped my grades a lot. My grades were about like B's and C's, and here they're A's and B's.
When Alex kind of was losing his faith in school and his motivation, and he, was feeling down on himself, to now see him re-engaged, energized, is a total blessing. And for my wife and I, it's been a huge relief. We feel like he has a home and he is learning and he's going to achieve his goals. And this is really setting him up for the future.
And now my favorite part of the show, where the numbers, the neuroscience, and the public policy intersect. It's time for the Research Roundup. Dyslexia impacts up to 1 in 5 students, according to the Yale Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. And yet, dyslexia is still so misunderstood. And only 17% of teachers in the U.S. feel prepared to teach students with dyslexia. And that's according to the National Center for Learning Disabilities. It's why these students so often have low self-esteem and experience anxiety. They're not always getting the support that they need in traditional school environments.
So one of the takeaways for me from our conversation with Dr. Dan was how impactful his own journey was with his own family and his kids being diagnosed with dyslexia, right? And I just wonder how many families we meet with where the parents aren't aware that dyslexia is actually genetic and that they too have been struggling with some of these same challenges their whole lives up until that point, but not understanding how they can advocate for themselves and for their children.
And I'm thinking about Dan himself, right? Obviously successful, a doctor, but what difference would it have made in his life had his teachers been able to recognize these things as well?
I mean, and a huge difference. Right? I mean, a huge difference. If he was able to, and if our children were able to get diagnosed earlier on, that can impact their confidence. It can impact the way that they're seen in the world, that they see themselves in the world, their self-actualization, and hopefully become really confident, powerful adults.
I'm thinking about us as parents, Lynna. I'm thinking about how many times we've caught ourselves, perhaps, saying, hey, you need to work a little bit harder. But I think back to what you were saying about that compassionate framework, that compassionate frame of mind as parents. Maybe they are working their hardest, and maybe there's something that we need to learn about our kids to be able to help support them. Something that maybe not diagnosed there.
Yeah, stay in tune, stay connected. The resources are out there. The learning options and school options are out there. It's just a matter of getting that information and applying it to advocate for your child best.
You got it.
Thanks so much for joining us on Learning Differently. We're grateful that you're here doing the work, asking the questions, and showing up for the students who need it most. Supporting learners who think and experience the world differently takes curiosity, care, and corazón, heart. Because when we understand how they learn,
we unlock who they can become.
See you next time.